Look, when the media shows you the vice lords, they don't tell a story. They create an image, and this is what they want you to see.
In Chicago, it happened again last night.
In a drive-by shooting.
Gang war.
Kids shooting kids.
The motive, drug turf.
Gang.
But what they don't want you to see is this.
Our problem is not among ourselves. If we don't be living in the environment and ain't got no jobs and ain't got no food coming from nowhere, no place, this is frustration. This creates problems.
The vice lords weren't born from crime. They were born from oppression. They shouldn't be labeled as a gang, but as an organization that tries to uplift and protect their community. If you like our content, like and subscribe to our channel and support us on conscioushistory.backme.org. And let's strive to be enlightened as we uncover the real untold history of the vice lords.
What I want you to take seriously is what we have to do for the youth. Right. Because we're coming up in a totally different world. Right. This is not the same world that you had. This is not the 60s. This is not that. We grew up BC, before crack. That should say it all. Right. You understand what I'm saying? We did not grow up without parents. You had parents that told you this and that, and this is what went on back in the day. Now you don't have that. Right. You have young kids, 14, coming home, their mama is smoking out or doing it to their best friend to get the product. So that means that it's not just about you taking care of your child, it's about you taking care of these children. Because that's what's out here.
The pimps and the pushers became the teachers, but what made that necessary? To understand, we have to go back to the why, the system, the history and the truth behind the vice lords. Around 1940, racism was seen everywhere in the US, but in the South it was more obvious, as many people were not hiring black people, and Jim Crow laws even forbid black people to own property. When a newspaper began writing about the success of black families in Chicago, who moved because of new jobs due to the war industry, many people who were living in extreme poverty saw Chicago as the promised land and decided to migrate for a better life for their family.
Most of the adults were born in rural areas of the South. They came to Chicago looking for a better way of life.
Upon arrival, many realized that the promised land was not what they had hoped for, as the migration created an immediate housing shortage. Next to this, the white neighborhoods feared that they would lose their jobs, which led to discrimination and violence and moving out of several neighborhoods.
Well, it's created a great deal of tension, not among the neighbors, because we all feel the same.
I don't want her associating with colored people, period.
Well, I'm very definitely against mixed marriages, and that's eventually what it's going to come to. If children are raised together, they're not going to think of anything of marrying together.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
Well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Therefore, the values of these neighborhoods were brought down, while real estate agents moved black families in, sticking them up with higher mortgages. Many rental properties were below standard and weren't maintained, but many families had no choice but to live in these conditions, because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else. Poverty grew, and around 1950 more and more families were placed into slum buildings with no centralized heating. The neighborhood lacked parks and recreation, leaving many young people left with boredom, poverty and frustration. This led to street fighting and altercations between different neighborhoods, all still while harassment was still present on the streets. Therefore, youth groups formed that would be known as neighborhood protection groups. It's now the later 1950s, and if you were a young black kid growing up in North Lawndale, you couldn't go anywhere or do anything without being in a youth group. Every piece of property on the west side belonged to a certain group. You couldn't go to the park, the pool, the theater or even the grocery store without some group harassing you. It got to the point that when you were growing up to a certain age, you had to make a decision of which youth group to join, and that choice depended on where you spent most of your time. Where were you the most? The pool, the theater or the park, and which was the closest to home? If you chose a group further from where you lived, you could have rival groups wanting to beat you up the moment you stepped out of the house. What started as neighborhoods fist-fighting with each other took a drastic turn the moment weapons were introduced. Suddenly, young men were being stabbed by knives or shot by guns. In 1957, Chicago police began a so-called massive gang crackdown against these youth groups and would beat them badly before incarcerating them. During one of these raids, the police arrested a young man who had just left home and was struggling with the harsh realities of violence and poverty. He was sent to St. Charles Juvenile Detention Center, and his name was Edwin Pepelo Perry. In the neighborhood, he was known as Eddie or Pep. He actually wanted to join a youth group while growing up but was denied for unknown reasons. Maybe it was fate. Knowing a leader could never be a follower, as he was 6'1" and already 190 pounds and had a solid reputation on the streets as a good boxer. The moment he stepped into the detention center, he would live up to the reputation, fighting with anyone who didn't respect him, and if new guys entered the facility, Pep would get them in check. When Pep found out his friend Leonard Calloway, otherwise known as Cal, was also staying in the detention center, he already had built up enough power to have him transferred to his room. From here the boys clicked up and formed a group of 7 with other youths in the center, so he could pull the strings to get the jobs they favored. This resulted in 7 young boys completely running the detention center and calling the shots on who got the best food and worked the best jobs. In the beginning, the 7 boys didn't have a name. Maurice Miller came up with the idea of conservative lads, but Pep wanted something different. He realized that, even in the detention center, they had the power to change lives, giving people jobs, creating status, and if this mindset could be carried into daily life, they could transform the entire community. Pep wasn't just thinking about a cool name, he was thinking about their reputation. He wanted members to be known as Lords of Vice, and so their name became Conservative Vice Lords. The young boys realized that many people on the streets wouldn't even know what conservative even meant, let alone how to pronounce it. So when all the boys got out by 1958, they would inform the streets about the Vice Lords, and so the nation was born. The boys knew from the detention center that to become lords in the system, you have to earn respect first. Pep brought in some close friends and picked fights, known back then as handbak, with other youth groups. And they fought with so much intent and dedication that after beating them, many youth groups flipped to Vice Lords. The difference between other youth groups and these young lords was that they really stood for change. If they could recruit the numbers on the outside, they could provide jobs that the whole community would benefit from. That desire for change made them fierce. They would approach individuals or groups and ask if they were already in a youth group. If they weren't but wanted to join, they would get blessed in right there on the spot. If they did not want to join or were already in one, they would fight, until they either switched or made a choice. Because for them, this was the only way the future youth could escape the system.
And they got no jobs, and they got no food coming from nowhere, no place. This is frustration.
They could be the lords that the community needed, the support system that none of the young boys had ever experienced. They loved teaching each other how to box, helping members finally stand up for themselves in a society that had neglected them. In 1959, they introduced new symbols, a top hat representing shelter, a glove representing purity, and a cane standing for strength. As the lords fought for a place their community could thrive, these symbols became a testament to their mission. The Vice Lords became a household name on the streets, and they gave curfews to other youth groups who hadn't switched yet. This resulted in altercations and led to 17-year-old Pep being sentenced to 6 months in jail. While locked up in the juvenile section, he demanded respect, fighting several youths. Authorities decided he was too much to handle and transferred him to the adult section with the grown men. But when he got there, he started beating up on the grown men too, until he built such a reputation reputation that he began controlling all the work in the adult section. For Pep, this was his way of demanding respect, and it caused many people to switch to vice lords because it meant getting the best treatment in jail. Most of the prison staff cooperated because many of them lived on the west side and didn't want to be facing problems when coming home. In 1961, Pep got out of jail and the nation was already operating as the organization he had envisioned. They were making money through hustles like offering protection to businesses in the community that faced harassment. If the system doesn't protect us, we protect us. This even led to conflicts with the Italian Mafia over territorial boundaries. However, the Italians respected the vice lords because of their reputation in the streets and their efforts to support the community. One of the most infamous vice lord reputation stories on the streets was about a rival youth group that started wearing the same clothing to represent their crew. Every time they saw rivals on the streets, they stripped them of their clothing, until they had gathered enough to use as disguises. When the rival youth group threw a party, around 100 lords, dressed in the stolen rival clothing, entered the party and beat up everyone inside. This bold move resulted in more youth groups flipping over to vice lords. By 1962, the organization had expanded and reached the Cabrini Green project. In 1963, the organization kept expanding, and in 1964 the numbers grew into the thousands. They had a headquarters on 16th Street, but the nation had grown so big that it was divided into many different factions. The vice lord leaders would gather on 16th Street, reflecting on the impact they had made in the community. If they had provided work inside the detention center, they could provide work on the streets. The whole community could make money, kids would feel safer, and the harassment on the streets would be less. Many troubled youths would have father figures to look up to, so they wouldn't have to do bad things. They wanted to let the conservatives speak through the actions of the vice lords. In the following years, they tried to stop the violence and protecting the neighborhoods from harassment. They knew they needed money to invest in businesses so the youth could get jobs and wouldn't be left hanging around on the streets. The lords wanted to deal with the system in the system's way. During this era, several factions operated individually, and one man that was known for having heavy hands and recruiting dozens of members was Willie Lloyd. Soon, he would become one of the most influential figures the vice lords had ever seen. In 1966, Pep stepped down as a key figure to spend more time with his family, continuing to work with the organization, just not as a public leader anymore. Some important figures who had already built up a solid reputation were the following. First, Alfonso Alfred, who became chief to manage the numbers and handle the financial aspect. Secondly, Bobby Gore, who became the spokesman for the organization since he passionately expressed the need for positive change for the youth.
What I'm saying, man, the things that we're doing to each other, we can't have it no more.
And lastly, David Darley, a researcher who was later granted the title White Vice Lord and helped apply for government funding. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago to address housing discrimination, poverty, and racial injustice in the city. The vice lords rallied with him, and it is said a spokesperson made the remark, "We don't need street dudes," on which the vice lords left the rally. Because of this action, Martin Luther King Jr. met with the conservative vice lords to tell them he needed them because they were fighting for the same cause, in which the conservative vice lords joined Martin Luther King, and this resulted in the long-awaited positive recognition from the government that they had been fighting for. In 1967, Chicago was hit with severe snowstorms that left much of the city buried. Cars couldn't move and poverty rose. Many youth groups turned to stealing and looting. The government feared that once winter ended, the looting would continue, and by summer they would have total chaos. To prevent this, the government arranged a meeting with several vice lords. David Darley was involved here too and helped them launch Operation Bootstrap, a cooperation to prevent riots that summer that would have cost these companies millions of dollars.
It's not coming from us, it's coming from environment. The brother is not his problem. His problem comes from someplace else. So what we're trying to create here is let's find out where our problems are coming from. This is one of the reasons why we're trying to find out right now where the Lord stands.
By the summer of 1967, the conservative vice lords didn't just keep riots off the streets. They also established divisions within the organization that dealt with education, law, order and justice. Thanks to David's research, the government granted funding to the conservative vice lords, and on September 11, 1967, Conservative Vice Lord Inc. was officially incorporated as a not-for-profit organization. Sometimes, luck is not on your side and fate can change the course of history. On April 4, 1968, the Conservative Vice Lord office was completed and its leaders were preparing to hold a press conference to announce the opening of Teen Town, a drop-in for the youth where you could get support with homework, tutoring or eat a snack. Just a neighborhood house that should have been there for these kids in the first place. But exactly on the day of the press conference, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis on Thursday evening, April 4th, 1968. The residents of the west side of Chicago had taken to the streets. The looting began almost immediately, and the outnumbered police could do little but watch.
In 1969, grants were given to the conservative vice lords, perfectly aligning with the vision of key figure Bobby Gore to give something back to the youth. 16th Street became the holy mecca, with Teen Town, an art and soul gallery, African line where they sold dashikis and jewelry, shops for African American women's beauty products, security businesses, and shops that help people fight the legal system. The Holy City was an example of building a better society. Newspapers lit up with headlines talking about how the vice lords had changed and were now a true community organization. But if you take away the guidance and money comes into the hands of those who are uneducated, those who are willing to work for the good of the system will end up never leaving the system that trapped them in the first place.
If you got to come out into the streets, and you ain't got nothing, to get out there in, you ain't even got a roof to put over your head, you're gonna have to do something to get that roof over your head,
The giving of money became a problem. Misappropriation of government funds in 1969 was an automatic prison sentence. People got their money and were sent to prison, and that was a government case. In 1969, Bobby Gore was taken away in handcuffs and accused of murder. The justice system did not allow the defense to further investigate and prepare a stronger case.
There was a fight broke out one night. A guy got killed out there. Okay, they found out I was in the area. When they finished, I was the one that committed the murder. I was sentenced to 25 to 40 years for something that I didn't do.
Gore maintained that his conviction was wrongful, asserting that he was striving for community improvement. Although he would be paroled 10 years later because of good behavior and activism, the guidance and light that the streets desperately needed were gone. The vice lords continued striving for positive change between 1969 and 1973, with their biggest movement being the LSD Coalition, where they joined forces with the Black P Stones and BGDs, forming what was known as the Lord Stones and Disciples. They heavily advocated for employment rights and trying to bring change.
In Chicago, 29 young persons have been killed in youth gang murders since January 1st.
When social welfare programs were cut and the media portrayed the negative, the struggles of the people who had no bread on their tables, the coalition crumbled. As a result, violence started peaking, fueled by another deadly killer in the streets: drug addiction. As the lights and ideals of the older generation were fading, and soldiers returned home from Vietnam, many youths began putting bread on their family's table by selling a drug soldiers had encountered overseas: heroin.
18-year-old Russell Corbeen has been arrested and charged with the fatal shooting of a 16-year-old boy and the wounding of another youth during a street gang dispute.
This resulted in youth groups having shootouts over who controlled certain areas and places packed with people injecting heroin. A leader that was still actually on the streets spreading a positive message was Alfonso Alfred, but in March of 1974 he was shot 3 times near his home. With his loss, the youth lost the guidance on the streets, and the hope that once shined as light was swallowed by darkness, replaced by money, drugs, violence, and not being able to leave the system. 16th Street, the place that was once seen as the holy Mecca, where members had put in their own hard work money to make something out of the community, soon fell into darkness. The very places that had been symbols of hope closed down, turning into centers for criminal activity and drug trafficking. Newspapers focused only on the stabbings and shootings, completely destroying the reputation the vice lords had built. When older members tried to restore that positive vision, the damage had already been done. Violence had stained their legacy, and no government would support what they now saw as nothing more than a group of criminals. Nobody wanted to admit that at one point the street group had saved each other. What had once been a rich man's vision had become a poor man's prison, leaving the true intentions hopeless and trapped in the shadows, unable to return to the light. This resulted in many youth groups on the streets running on the heroin superhighway, where streets became divided. Most of the organizations were divided in areas that would kill and fight to maintain territory, solely for the purpose of drug profits, leading to shootings, bigger guns, and many mothers who had to bury their children. The soldiers ran the streets with guns, while their leaders were incarcerated. Mothers, desperate for help, called on old friends inside to look after their children who had been sent to jail. Things could have turned differently if Bobby Gore had been granted an honest trial. While in prison, he tried to maintain the positive spirit for the intention he opened 16th Street. In 1976, while in jail, he created the Vice Lord flag, including the 5-point star, which was the base for the organization. It didn't stand for death and destruction, it stood for love, peace, truth, freedom and justice. This is what righteous young lords took an oath for.
In Chicago tonight, police say that street gangs are to blame for a shooting on the city's south side. 4 teenagers all...
What needs to be understood is that people view things based on how they are portrayed by the media. What was in the media was the violence that was happening inside the prisons between several youth groups. What was not in the media was the creation of the Folk and People Nation alliances inside the prison system, which drastically reduced prison violence. The Vice Lords played a key role in the creation of the People Nation, alongside the El Rockans and Black P-Stones, with who they were deeply connected, as some lords had relatives in these other organizations. Because of this influence, the Vice Lords adopted Islamic symbols and bylaws that would promote peace between factions. This unity was acknowledged by the phrase, "all is well." The adaptation of some Islamic principles brought a spiritual aspect to some Vice Lord chapters that provided peaceful guidance and brought discipline to members. The pyramid was adopted as a new symbol which stood for strength through unity. The champagne glasses and rise of the Almighty People Nation, 32212 standing for the letters in the alphabet, and of course the hand symbol that had always represented them, making a tree with the hand to make Vice Lord. For lords, these weren't just symbols, they were a representation of what it meant to be a lord. These symbols embodied their identity, status, and it made them feel righteous, because they stood for the peace they believed in, as it reminded them of their purpose and unity. Some of the leaders who brought guidance on the streets had passed away. At the same time, many activists were fighting to get Bobby Gore out of prison. After serving 10 years, the State Parole Board granted his release in 1979. However, when he walked back onto the streets in the early 80s, his light could not clear the darkness that had hit the streets in a newly formed enemy: crack cocaine. Drug traffickers in the US began producing a smokable, cheaper form of cocaine by mixing it with baking soda and water, then heating it to create rocks. The crack cocaine epidemic exploded. It was cheap, highly addictive and brought in more money than ever. Children lost their parents to crack addiction. Neighborhoods turned into war zones as groups marked territory and hijacked project buildings for distribution. It got to the point where it became so bad that people got stationed on top of buildings in the Cabrini Green projects and other areas with snipers, ready to shoot anyone who came too close to their territory.
Last year, 200 people were shot or stabbed in Cabrini. 8 violent crimes for every 100 people.
In the 80s, several buildings and areas became war zones to the extent that you couldn't drive down certain streets unless you were approved by the group controlling the area. Cops had to use bulletproof shields just to enter several buildings, while drug houses had secret escape routes. Police helicopters were forced to retreat, mothers were burying their children, and young kids were growing up in crack houses. One group even hijacked an ice cream truck to hide bodies and transport weapons. Ambulances refused to enter certain neighborhoods without police escorts, leaving the streets in total chaos, with each faction dependent on their own street or neighborhood. Now that most of their leaders had either passed away or were incarcerated, many people started losing hope. But one respected leader who would soon walk back on the streets, the man with heavy hands, was Willie Lloyd, who recruited dozens of members and wrote the Order of Lordism in prison. Eventually, he was released from prison in 1992. Allegedly, he was given one of the highest ranks in certain factions, and was picked up by 5 limousines who were waiting for him outside of jail. But when he returned to the streets in the 90s, total chaos followed. Many factions were divided and many people were making money independently, no longer showing the same respect for their elders, especially those who had grown up without parents due to the crack epidemic.
Curfew enforcement, which began last month, is just one new weapon being used in a violent Chicago gang war. The motive, drug turf. Authorities were able to intercept more than a ton of cocaine recently, but stopping gang gunfire has been harder.
The 90s became a period of an all-out gang war between different factions. Money from street activities brought in bigger guns like AK-47s and Uzis, stashes of grenades were found in trap houses, and silenced pistols were used to carry out quiet hits. This resulted in higher-ranking members having to walk around with bulletproof vests and armed security. In this period, there was credit card fraud, money laundering, sniper attacks, and rivals throwing Molotov cocktails into trap houses. SWAT police stormed buildings, shooting anyone on sight. Chicago bled, mothers cried, and death and destruction followed. The man who came from a time when guidance was actually the input, King or OG Willie, lost people close to him in a suspected retaliation hit. Seeing those around him follow a path of death and destruction, knowing he came from an era where everything stood for something, changed him internally, to the point where he would want to make a difference.
It's like the younger guys against the older guys, and the younger guys basically were winning.
In 1994, King Willie was arrested, and while in jail he became a critic of gang life. He tried to educate the youth from behind bars to not step into a life of violence, as this was not the reason the vice lords were created in the first place. The media did not care for this take. Crime, drugs and drive-by shootings filled up the headlines, and Willie was blamed simply because of his high status. When King Willie got out in 2001, he tried to educate, but even these actions would be negatively portrayed. His attempt to take young men to the streets where everything started for the organization was simply put away as dangerous and controversial. But this would not be the same world King Willie grew up in. This was a totally different world. This was not the 60s. Many factions had grown up without guidance, without a future, only knowing drugs and violence, and they didn't care about the base foundation. The FBI was hitting anyone with RICO charges. It was kill or be killed. In 2003, while walking with his dogs, King Willie experienced his 3rd assassination attempt, this time being shot 4 times. It would lead to him being paralyzed from the neck down, leaving yet another family with stress, struggles, and fear that they would have to carry with them for the rest of their lives. But even with his injury, he would remain involved in efforts to steer youths away from gang life and worked with organizations focused on violence prevention. While articles often highlighted his struggles with substance abuse, fewer covered his role in guiding young men towards peace. Just like all high-ranked members, he became a lord to become righteous, to understand peace and love, and dedicate himself to the true meaning of conservative, not being a product of your environment, but to be the product for your environment, striving for your people.
It bothers me that I have to sidestep my youth to stand up and do some shit that somebody else supposed to be doing. There's too many men out here for me to be doing this, because it ain't my turn yet. I'm supposed to be following behind him getting the knowledge. I don't even got a chance to get the fucking knowledge. I can't go to college. There's too much problems out here. I don't got the money. Nobody do. You understand what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is it's not as easy as we mapping it out to be. And we gotta stay real. We gotta stay real. Before we can be New African, we gotta be black first.
In this short documentary, we wanted to dive into the untold history of the Vice Lords, a story we believe is often stigmatized and framed negatively. But by understanding the principles and struggles those young lords faced, we can recognize those who accepted the fate of fighting a system that was against them in the first place and still chose love, peace, truth, freedom and justice. The true intention of the Vice Lords was to put knowledge into the youth and to leave the world in a better state than the one they were born into. If you like our content, like and subscribe to our channel and support us on conscioushistory.backme.org. We love making in-depth history videos. And see you next time at Conscious History.